Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name's Naomi and I'm a Methodist minister based in North Kent. And today's guest is Eddie Boon, our new host. Welcome, Eddie.
Thank you.
Eddie grew up in Bournemouth and began to follow Jesus Christ when he was 16 years of age. He currently lives in East London, serving the Thames North Synod of the United Reformed Church as Discipleship Enabler Special Category Ministry. His main focus is encouraging people, leaders, and churches in becoming more intentional in whole life discipleship. Seeing the church as being the church, whether gathered or scattered, has been an important aspect, and Eddie enjoys collaborating with the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, LICC. He's also had the privilege of assisting bringing about new Christian communities and pioneering contexts in his synod area. For nearly 40 years, Eddie has served and led URC congregations in East Manchester, Haydock and St Helens, St Mary Cray in South East London, Hythe in Hampshire, and has served on a number of regional and national committees over the years, and has experience of ministry in the Church of South India. He's a massive fan of Everton FC, but we won't hold that against him,
Yeah.
Hampshire County Cricket, and the band The Stranglers. He loves to swim, cycle, walk, go to the theatre, cinema and art galleries, and to take part in book clubs locally. We're delighted to have you here, Eddie, and we're really looking forward to your season as host.
Thank you.
And joining us from JPIT today is Thomas Niblett, JPIT's intern for the Constituency Action Network. Welcome, Thomas.
Hi there.
So, Eddie, if we could kick things off by asking you, does politics belong in the pulpit?
Well, I'm sure I'll say, as all your guests have said, yes, definitely. I guess everyone will have a slightly different definition of what politics is. Um, and to me, it's all about how power is exercised, how resources are shared, and how communities and nations and, if you like, blocks around the world cooperate or are in conflict. And that involves sort of negotiation and compromise. So it's really about the whole of life. And I've always believed there's a place for it. It's so important to recognize the God of whole life, and that includes how power operates. My slight hesitation is that there's nothing worse than sitting listening to a sermon or preaching a sermon where you suddenly feel you're just falling into line with total tribalism and polemic instead of seeking first the kingdom of God. So politics is life, and if we didn't have the word politics, we would still have life. And any sermon, any teaching, any preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ has to reach into every part of the congregation's life and also into the community. And an interesting, Thomas's work with the Constituency Action Network, seeing how it's not just about national politics, it's about how often we can involve politics on a local basis in the situations that we are based in our places. So a big fat yes.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that answer, Eddie. So, just to set some of the context for our conversation, obviously, as usual, we're recording this in advance, so things will have changed. But in the headlines today, likely Prime Minister in waiting, Andy Burnham, sets out his regional devolution plans as he announces his programme for government. Search and rescue teams continue to arrive in Venezuela to find earthquake survivors. The extreme heat wave continues across Central and Eastern Europe. And after defeating Panama 2-0, England faces the DRC on the 1st of July, who'll be appearing for the first match in 52 years after a 3-1 victory over Uzbekistan. We're going to be looking together at the readings for Sunday, the 12th of July. So we'll be looking at Genesis 25, verses 19 to 34, Psalm 119, verses 105 to 112, Romans 8, verses 1 to 11, and Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 to 9 and 18 to 23. In terms of awareness days, we're coming into Plastic Free July. So, with all of that in mind, let's dig into the texts. And shall we start with our gospel for the day with the Matthew passage? Eddie, we'd
Yeah,
love to hear some of your thoughts about this one.
yeah, yeah, of course. It's really a passage which has been so preached on and so heavily shared or understood. It's one of those passages that we actually get an explanation for, which is quite helpful. And it's possibly a passage which can be interpreted in so many different ways. There's a real challenge to the preacher. There's obviously been a big debate about, do we treat a parable as having only one meaning, or do we allegorize it? And this parable does lend itself to that sort of allegory. So it's something that's this sort of fertile ground, good growth. Interesting, listening to Andy Burnham's pitch for the Labour Party leadership this morning. Good growth was at the forefront, and that whole concept of growth in our Christian theology, our preaching, can there be growth? It isn't good growth, and what is sustainable and what is um, treating the world gently in terms of the context of growth is such a live issue for the Christian, I think, and for the issues of justice and poverty around the world. And there's a it's interesting to think about these different, the path, the unresponsive, the rocky ground, the shallowness, the thorny ground, the distracted, and then the good soil, which is the responsive. And it's the hopeful thing about that, the real good news about that, is that the seed of the kingdom of God does take root in places and spaces in our world. And that's what Jesus was saying. We can get a bit bogged down in the negative. I think we can get bogged down in the ground where the seed doesn't take root. The context of this, of course, Jesus sitting down, uh, doing a bit of a beach mission. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that it's a fairly rare occurrence of Jesus telling a parable primarily for the crowd. And he's sitting down, he's adopting that um, teaching role for the crowd in a place, unlike our beaches, in a place of work, the
Mm.
whole life place where many of the people would be doing their everyday fishing, um, buying and selling. And the context of the parable is well known, the small farm, small plots of land, sowing produce which can be traded and sold, very different to the sort of industrial complex that we're probably familiar with today. So, I mean, that's the context. But the thing that I really um, sensed, and I'd never heard this quote before, but I came across this quote in one of the commentaries from St. John Chrysostom, who lived in the sort of late fourth century. And I've been really mulling this over since I saw this passage was the passage for today. He said this, but do thou mark this, I pray thee, that the way of destruction is not one only, but there are differing ones, and wide apart from one another. Let us not soothe ourselves upon our not perishing in all these ways, but let it be grief in whichever way we are perishing. And just to maybe decode that, I read that as saying, don't get bogged down, or don't get into the sense of feeling that there's only one context. It's sort of a very untribal thing to realize that we need to examine ourselves in feeling that we must stand up for something, in terms of justice or the kingdom or politics. And I think we just need to be quite careful and quite discerning, maybe quite growing in our humility, that we aren't just picking up another destructive way. And I think this parable reminds us of that. And that quote really suggests that don't think there's only two types of soil, one which is great and the kingdom grows, and one which is anti God and anti the kingdom of God. There's actually quite, I would say, sinister or pervasive things which can draw us away from the things of God. And there's lots to say on populism, maybe. In politics, it's easy for people to give easy, quick answers that will either scratch where people itch or reinforce people's prejudices. But there's a reminder that we can do so much. We can do so much better. But the bad news is all sorts of ways, all sorts of barriers to good growth. But the good news is that and it's Isaiah 55, is it? When the word goes out, it does produce a crop, and it does produce fruit. And that's something I always cling onto as a preacher, because it can be quite challenging sometimes when you're preaching week in, week out, and you feel, is my message ever having effect? I've just come back from sabbatical, and part of my sabbatical was interviewing 18, doing some qualitative research with 18 serving ministers who haven't retired yet, but have been in ministry for about the same length as me, which is sort of 35 to 40 years, to talk with them about what things have helped them through these decades. And one of the things that nearly everyone said was a reminder that the church isn't our ownership. And I see this in this passage and a lot of the crop parables, if you like, that God is ultimately the one who provides and is at work despite some of the challenges and despite some of the grounds that the seed is planted in. And I guess that relates it to some of the Old Testament passages in the lectionary readings as well. This idea of God being present and bringing the rains, which is quite challenging in times of climate change and heat
Mhm.
waves, to see God as a God who provides in that way.
Thank you, Eddie. That was really rich. There was so much there, including things that, as you say, it's a very familiar passage, that there are things that I'd never thought of before, like it being a place of work rather than a place of leisure on the beach where Jesus is telling this story. I hadn't noticed that before, so thank you for that.
Mm.
Thomas, what were your thoughts about this passage?
Yeah, I think I wanted to pick up on what you said, Eddie, about um, the church not being kind of our own machine. It's very much, a gift of God. I looked at Working Preacher, which is an American Lutheran preaching resource, and he mentioned that just before this, in verse 16, 17, there's the idea of the gift of understanding, and the idea that the good soil isn't good because of us. It's a gift. It's God's agency.
Mm.
So that kind of goes both ways, that there are things that we can see that kind of put us out of step, out of line with God, and that bring us into it. I think it's important not to see that as sort of fixed soil, that the church is good soil and that's
Yeah,
fixed.
yeah,
And everything
yeah,
else that can be very dangerous, and it leads to arrogance, right? It made me think of maybe colonial understandings of, sort of mission and discipleship, that we have God and we bring God out to other people rather than seeing God as dwelling in all people.
yeah,
That you've got to be very careful to not to be humble in the way that we think about what good soil looks like, and does it just align with our own kind of preconceptions, or are we really being challenged? Especially, verse 22, the idea of being sown amongst thorns, and the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choking it sounds very familiar. That sounds like
yeah,
things that happen to the church, especially in in a Western context, in a wealthy place, in a place where there is material wealth and abundance, and it's quite easy to normalize that. It made me think in the Romans, there's that the cares of the flesh as well. It's that these kind of material excesses move us out of step with God. That this, the kind of rich abundance described of of the good seed and the good soil doesn't mean like material excess. It doesn't mean kind of just prosperity gospel or something.
Mm.
It's about God's creation being good and delivering for us. Not from our own agency and our own exploitation of the earth, if we're thinking about it from a kind of creation care angle, but because of God's gift, and that we always have to remember that. I can imagine it's really important for ministers to remember that, the church isn't theirs and that it's their agency, it's God's agency. And we've thought as a team within JPIT a bit about, decolonization, and all of our denominations are wrestling with legacies of slavery, of enslavement, and the trade in enslaved people. So how do we really embed that when we read, especially parables we're really familiar with? I think is really important. Let anyone with ears listen, which I really like as a phrase, um, right at the heart of it. That it's about anybody. It's an equality of audience, and when we combine that with thinking about our kind of agency and ownership of church, and this is God's church and God's kingdom, do we really extend that position of this is for all people? Anyone with ears, I think, that's quite radical. That's not about anyone with a kind of brain, or anyone with the kind of intellectual capability to think about the theology of this. It's any people, anyone with ears is really a really expansive view of what the human is, right? It's defining it by a kind of something that God has created that we have, not the kind of our own learning, our own development, or our own, the works we've done, or the wealth we've made, or the contribution we've made to society or something. It's just because we bear the image of God. So
Yeah, definitely.
Yes,
Yeah,
and that very much matches up with the idea of the seed being scattered everywhere, doesn't it? The word of God is being offered to everyone in every context. Eddie.
yeah. It's a question, I guess, for congregations or preachers. How diverse are the congregations that are sitting listening to the particular services? Are people feeling like they're preaching to the converted? That's still a good thing because of all the issues are raised up. But sometimes at a very basic level, Thomas, I think what I'm hearing also that just a very background sort of smugness in the sense of yes, this is where we are, and it loses its sort of radical cultural transformation. And one of the other things that came into my mind as you were speaking, it's quite a vulnerable thing. Let those that have ears to hear, because you could as a preacher say, well, I'm just going to go out there and just not be responsible in the way that I preach, because it's God's work. And I think that's not what this parable is teaching us.
And thank you for some of the things that you shared earlier about growth. I thought those were really interesting, about different kinds of growth. I had a tutor at theological college who felt very strongly that the idea that economic growth is always a good thing, we should always be striving for more and more growth, was not a Christian way of thinking, and that we should be pushing back against that, because pushing for growth is not always the same as pushing for human flourishing.
Yeah.
So really interesting to think about growth in the context of this passage. What I do love is that enormous yield at the end. I like Paula Gooder's book about parables, and she talks in that about how the expected yield at this time would have been maybe 5 to 1, or at the most 15 to 1. And we have this idea of the seed in the good soil yielding 100 to 1.
Yeah.
And that image of abundance and abundant life. And what does it look like if we base our politics on an economy of abundance rather than an economy of scarcity? And we think about how we share things with one another in that way. Eddie, can I ask you, are there one of the other passages for this week that you would be particularly keen to connect up with the Matthew passage?
Well, I think that Genesis 25 passage
Mm.
does connect quite strongly what we talked about ownership, because it does delve a bit into this concept of inheritance. I think it was Thomas that mentioned about feeling that we've already discussed that we own the church, or we almost own the kingdom.
Mm.
And Genesis 25, I've also got floating in my mind. It's not one of the passages, but 3 chapters later, one of my guiding passages is when he wakes up from a dream, Jacob, and he says, "I did not know it, but I realized that God was in this place. Surely
Mm.
God was in this place, and I did not know it." And that's a reminder to connect to all of life. But in Genesis 25, it's like this birth rivalry of Jacob and Esau, and this inheritance issue, and this um, birthright, and this ownership thing, which obviously perhaps isn't in everyday living now, because most of this sort of inheritance types of thinking in terms of the first male um, isn't there. But to me, I think there's a bit of work thinking about, for them, success and growth was maintaining the family um, inheritance, the family wealth. And, when we think about, it's part of the thing about Job, isn't it? That, that's all lost to someone. How do they deal? But keeping your riches and your wealth and your property as effective was very much a thing, I'm sure, in those Old Testament times. And that does relate a bit to our um, sustainability. What do we no longer think in that terms, although the whole issues of political taxation and taxing of inheritance and all those sorts of thing, and people in their minds almost spending the money that they think they're going to inherit. As a pastor dealing with funerals, I've come across that, where you sort of sense this feeling that people are just glad, got to be careful what I say, but you sense this thing about people feel a right to what somebody else is going to give them. And here we have Jacob and Esau, and a terrible act of deceit, really, um, and sort of deception and lying, and it doesn't end up well. And I wonder how we think about the sort of the underdog, or the firstborn, or that power dynamic, hold less firmly to that sense of inheritance,
Mm.
um, to be giving it away in a way. I don't know. It's
Mm.
radical. Um,
Yes, I saw Thomas nodding enthusiastically a couple of times there. Were there particular bits of what Eddie said that you really responded to, Thomas?
So no, yeah, I think especially inheritance, I struggle with because I think it's really interesting that it's one of those things that's really stuck. I listened to somebody. I was on a podcast once. Someone said if you read the Communist Manifesto or kind of early utopian socialists, right, lots of what they said then that was unimaginable, like
mm,
a healthcare service for everybody, not a health insurance model or something, has become very normalized. It's not as radical as early Victorian utopian socialists imagined, right? But a lot of those concepts of the welfare state have become really normal for us. The thing that hasn't is the idea of inheritance being abolished. That was what early, British socialists wanted, was to abolish the concepts of inheritance. That is unimaginable in our
mm,
society, I think. People would really struggle. I think you're right, Eddie, that the idea of an inheritance tax is the sort of thing that gets people very, very,
mm,
very fine. And I understand it. And I think this is a really interesting story because it shows that inherent that kind of tension over it is not new at all. This is a really fundamental tenet of the way that God wants us to think about who we are as people and family. I think God really is playing in this story with the idea of who the underdog is, as you said, Eddie, and who who kind of gets to define the future as a family who has the agency. I think it is a message of God rooting for the disadvantaged because, you know, again, working preacher gave me the little bit of context. It was very helpful that obviously it's easy to read Esau as the kind of um, as the victim, but of course he, as the elder, was in a position of power, and had the, would have been the one out hunting, would have got his lion's share of the hunts and stuff. So it's not like he is only it's complex, it's not a simple story, and actually it means we need to question who we root for when we kind of fall into binaries, maybe like
Yeah,
populist binaries, as you say, Eddie, because God doesn't make it easy or
yeah,
clear sometimes. This is quite a challenge. I also think there's a little bit of things about masculinity here. It's interesting that it's mentioned that Rebecca prefers Jacob. And the patriarch Isaac prefers his firstborn, obviously, as you'd expect. But the one who wins out is the favorite of his mother, right? So there's definitely an interesting thing about it's not being based on the kind of merit of the person, again linking to that gospel passage. It's not maybe it's not really about the merits of what we do in our actions. Actually, it's bigger than that, and
yeah,
it's about God's plan
yeah,
for that goes beyond us and beyond our own inheritance.
yeah. So
Specifically, gone.
sort of patronage and the favor of someone else. Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
Mm.
And I
The,
think you're
the,
really right, Thomas, to note the complexity of that, because I think there's the temptation to always look for a hero and someone to root
mm.
for in any Bible story, but some of them are descriptive rather than prescriptive. And there's
yeah,
Yes.
stories about a whole bunch of people behaving badly. And
yeah,
there isn't really a hero. I mean, in this, we've got both parents playing favorites. We've got Esau not recognizing his privilege, really, sitting lightly to it, but in a bad way. He's not
Mm.
giving it away because he wants to empower someone else. He's giving it away because in that moment he doesn't recognize the importance of what he has. He's just really hungry. And
Yeah.
then we've got Jacob uh, tricking someone and taking advantage of Esau's hunger, Esau's need. And how much do we see that in the world of people taking advantage of the immediate needs of others in order to gain something for themselves? So I think you're really right to recognize the complexity of this and that perhaps there isn't really a hero in this story.
no,
It's just a bunch of people behaving
I
in a
think
very
yeah.
subpar way, but
yeah.
somehow God is still
And
at
it's a
work
bit,
in all of
it's a bit
this.
like us, and it's a bit like the next chapter of the story, isn't it? With Jacob and Joseph, is that it
Mm.
ripples on, doesn't it? Who's the hero? Who's taking advantage? Who's reveling in their inheritance, and who's showing favoritism? It goes on and on, and even in this reset that Thomas mentioned, in terms of inheritance and stuff, I think people will go to the Jubilee, and it's a great thought, and it was a great idea. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that it actually um, really happened or worked in any real sense. But there are countries around the world. I think of France, for example, where to rent a property is just such a more normal everyday thing. There isn't this obsession about owning, and they don't even know how they have plenty of problems. This whole idea of property being to make money and not just about a place to live has got us into a bit of a pickle, really, because I mean, I've got three 20 somethings, a daughter and two sons, and the thought of them being able to step onto the property ladder is just so ridiculous at the moment, even though they're able to earn a reasonable wage, and we've got ourselves in that position that, if you like, there's been a golden generation, and we have a generation coming now, which for the first time for what, 50 years maybe, the next generation is up and coming generation is poorer than the one before. And that's that goes back to that sort of preaching to the converted in the congregations that we hinted at, that we can think, yeah, we're the good soil and this that and the other. But that's a reminder that there are people today that just do feel disenfranchised, and not even people, only people who are in the sort of poverty end of the spectrum, but people who are contributing and earning are still disenfranchised because of the capitalist market economy of people who are wanting to see the increased yield of growth in their investments, and all the bond markets and all that sort of thing, and what is basically gambling now, these I forget, poly markets, isn't it? I'm no expert at all, but every time there's announcements there's peace in Iran, the poly markets go up, and somebody somewhere makes a load of money, and then more missiles are, are launched, and it just shows you how money seems to be at the root of many of these problems. We've got to late on in this podcast before we talked about war, but I think they are related, about the fertile soil. What type of soil is it that is so toxic? Maybe today we would add a fifth soil, which is like irradiated, full of pollution and full of nasty stuff, which is pouring in, and that's like some of the ground today, and that's the root of populism. Sort of scorch the world, just do what we think will make us more money, with no. And it's so tough when that is supported by so-called professing Christians in various places of the world. So
Yes,
tough.
we've been touching on the dangers of Christian nationalism a lot in recent
Yeah,
weeks on this podcast.
yeah.
Now, I'm aware, Eddie, that we've got limited time left. There's been so much to get into with the Genesis and the Matthew passages. I'd love to ask whether there was anything that struck you about either the Psalm or the Romans passage.
There is a shift in focus sometimes with the New Testament, or seeming shift in focus, in terms of the Romans 1, spiritual life and peace and the promise of resurrection. And it's easy to feel that as slightly internalizing it and individualizing it. But I don't think that is true, because shalom, life and peace and wholeness, flourishing, cannot happen in isolation. So I'd really want to avoid like a false dichotomy. And I'd want to cling to those words of Psalm 65 of this God as sustainer, so that the things around us are not commodities to be exploited, but a trust, or given and supplied and sustained in trust, which do involve some of our management as well. And politics, you can't just sit back and do nothing locally or nationally or internationally. You have to take decisions, and you have to live by them, and you have to be open to change. You have to be humble. But as I seek to live out my life as a Christian and encouraging other Christians, it's how do I live it out in my everyday life, in my attitude, in my conversations, in my workplace, in my do people believe by what they see in my life that God is a God who shows up? And that's the theme of Isaiah 65. God is present. God hasn't just left us to our own devices. God has shown up and calls us to join in, not in a real deterministic or fatalistic sort of way, but in a way that is collaborative and partnership and community. And I'd long to see our congregations grow in that, in their local communities and neighbourhoods, and make a real connection with the local people, and yes, connection with their MPs and local council. We've got a load of new councillors, haven't we? And now is a great opportunity for churches to make a contact and be a really wholesome and healthy voice to try and express the fact that God is present in that community.
The first verse in the Psalm, verse 105, the light to your path. I really liked that path of God, like the path of the sower, the path of being in step with God, of falling on good soil, living according to the word and the spirit. And that's something, I think a lot of churches suffering kind of lots and lots of difficult things at the same time, or lots of demands on them, remembering the pathway as a kind of movement forwards is really helpful. I think that's other psalms are often very helpful when, to think about journeys or kind of movements towards God. I find very helpful, to kind of bring you back into that mindset of being in step with God, and especially, verse 106 as well, swearing an oath. We as the J Pit residential was in Manchester quite recently, and in the People's History Museum, which incidentally is where Andy Burnham is. Or was this morning, giving his talk. But there was a whole section on the Tolpuddle martyrs and the swearing of oaths that they were kind of prosecuted for, and it made me think about the power of swearing an oath that sort of invokes divine witness. That's the dictionary definition, right, of an oath that shows your allegiance and can be is kind of seen as a bit secret, maybe a bit dirty, but actually I think for us as Christians it's an open thing. You're openly swearing your oath, and that's a vouching of confidence. And it's also, again, thinking about that journey, it's about forever, right? I know an oath doesn't really. I think about Harry Potter, and the kind of the deals that they make. What's it called? I can't remember.
The unbreakable vow.
Thank you. That's forever. The whole thing is about, it's kind of eschatological, right? It's about thinking about the end of that there isn't really an end. That the oath goes all the way through. So I think, especially for churches feeling a bit like, in a real time of turmoil, that's the path forward is really helpful to think about. That's the psalmist said that, and we're always thinking about that long journey.
That's right. I mean, the Eugene Peterson's book, isn't it? A long obedience in the same direction is a reminder of that. Steady. It may not be too exciting, but that steady discipleship, very different to that sort of rocky ground, and this consistency and integrity, so much different to that populist route, the art of the deal. Make an offer, you don't really believe it, and then you change your mind, and then we've got this constant game playing instead of, if you like, this solid commitment. And that verse 107, I'm severely afflicted. Give me life, O Lord, according to your word. Accept my free will offerings of praise. And I'm guessing as people are sitting listening to sermons, as they have done in recent months and years, and in the coming Sundays, they're in the sense in which corporately we do feel a bit like we're severely afflicted. Things just don't seem, they seem a bit broken, they seem a bit irredeemable, they seem a bit afflicted, and we are charged with that challenge of bringing the hope that does exist. Give me life, O Lord, according to your word. And that's sometimes that can be a real statement, despite the evidence that we see around us, that I believe you will give me life according to your word. And maybe that's a prayer for the church in difficult seasons like today.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that the final line of that chunk of Psalm that we have, where it says, I incline my heart to perform your statutes forever to the end, that makes it really clear that this is a long-term thing. doesn't it? This
Mm.
isn't something we're just committing to for the day. And so it takes that perseverance and that persistence. I think there's an interesting connection there with the Genesis passage.
Yeah, and with the
Obviously,
Matthew,
Isaac
yeah.
had been waited for a century, and then he and Rebecca are married for 20 years before they're able to have a child. And there's a lot of waiting. When waiting is difficult, there's a lot of persistence and perseverance. And I think you're right that what we get from this psalm is that when we as churches are finding that hard, that work of persevering and persisting, that it's the word of God that enlivens us, that brings us joy and strength, and that gives us a direction to follow. So I
Yeah.
think that's a really helpful and hopeful note to end on. So thank you so much for everything that both of you have shared today, Thomas and Eddie. Eddie, we're really looking forward to your season as you step
Thank
in
you.
as host. So thank you so much for agreeing to do that. And thank you to everyone who's joined us listening today. And thank you from me for this season. I've really enjoyed being your host, and to all the guests who've come along and joined me. I've learned so much and thoroughly enjoyed myself. So thank you. We hope that today, in what you've heard, there'll be something useful that will equip and enable you in your preaching and leading of worship and in your discipleship as well. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Please do share this episode with your friends. And we've also got some online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. So thank you for joining us today, and may God bless you.
Thank you, Naomi.